All right, so now we're going to show you how to put your awesome animations you made into Unity.
Want me to just give you some animations?
Sure. You just put them in like the Google Drive or something. So first thing that we're going to do is just make another new Unity project. We'll call this one like Animation Workshop. And we'll start with the 2D preset since we're going to be doing 2D animations for stuff. A lot of the stuff that you'll learn for Unity's Animator is actually pretty applicable to 2D and 3D. But 2D is the easiest one to get set up with, and sprite sheets are something that you're going to be doing a lot of if you've got a 2D game. So here we go. We've got our default setup for stuff. So first thing that we got to go do is get our sprite sheet. And then we'll just take these. To put it in our assets folder, we'll just right-click on our project and go to Show and Explore. And then we want to go put it in Assets. And to try to keep your project pretty tidy, I usually make a couple folders categorized by what type something is. So these are going to be some sprite sheets. So just make a folder called Sprite Sheets and paste it in there. And so now we've crossed the gap. It's no longer an asset that our artists are working on. It's now something that we want to put in the game. This is something to keep in mind. Like Ian said earlier, be nice to your programmers because typically when you're working with your artists, if you have to get up and go over and say, hey, what is the FPS this is supposed to run at? The artist is typically going to be something like, let me go check. And the less that you have to do that, the better your workflow is going to be between your programmers and your artists. The ultimate goal being that you don't have to get up and interrupt each other every couple minutes to try and get some more information. So now we've got these two sprite sheets in here. Go back to Unity, it'll show up, and we can take a look at these. One of the first things that we're going to do is change our import settings for our sprite sheet. Our texture type we're going to leave as a sprite. And then our sprite mode, we're going to change to multiple. We've got a couple sprites in this single sheet. And our pixels per unit, you can leave it at the default if it looks good for you. This just changes the size of the sprites relative to their game objects. We'll leave it at 100 for now. And then there are two more options down here, generate bitmaps and filter mode. If you've done some 3D stuff, you might be a little more familiar with these. Bitmaps are basically level of detail maps for your textures. This makes it so if you have a giant plane that's just nothing but checkerboard, when it gets all the way out in the distance, it doesn't get into that ugly black and white speckliness. It actually fades to a nice gray. This is good for things that you plan on treating like 3D objects and bad for things that you plan on treating like 2D objects. You don't want your 2D objects, like your sprites, to get blurry as you go away, as you move the camera away from them. That's something that you want to do in 3D. So we're going to turn generate bitmaps off for this. And then our filter mode is bilinear right now. There is another setting in here that will be different for sprites versus 3D textures. For this, we're going to change it to point. Our filter mode basically determines how we're going to blend the pixels of our object together when we need to shrink it or grow it. So if we have a texture and we magnify it a lot, bilinear is going to give us a smooth interpolation and it's going to make it blurry as it expands, and point filtering is going to make it blocky, sort of like how Minecraft does. So I can illustrate this real quick. You'll also probably want to change your format from compressed to true color. This won't turn up most of the time, but if your sprites look different in Unity than they do from your artist, then occasionally compression will introduce artifacts. So just keep that in mind. So just make a new game object for it. So we'll start with our game object. We'll call it our princess. Starting at 0, 0. And the component we're going to add to it is going to be under rendering sprite renderer. So this sprite renderer component all it does is render a sprite. We'll change this to single sprites for now, so that we can play around with them just as giant images. Later, we'll change them to multiple sprites so we can see the differences between them. But we'll just drag this out here and zoom in. And you can see that if we go in too far, we can see every individual pixel on this image. But if we change our filter mode to bilinear, then it gets all blurry like this.
Pukey.
Doesn't look as good, especially if this isn't the style that you're going for, which is why we suggest point filtering. And then generating bitmaps, I don't know if we'll be able to see much of it. I don't think we're going to see much of it in the editor, because I don't really think the editor utilizes bitmaps either way. But we'll leave that off and change it to point filtering so that we can see every last pixel of it. It's really just a question of whether you want your sprites to look pixely or if you want them to look smooth. For most people, pixely is what you want, especially if you're going for pixel art style. Doesn't make sense to get blurry pixel art. So we'll just apply those, and we're good to go. Now we've got just one basic sprite in Unity, but this is all the frames of our animation, and we want to splice out the individual frames. So we'll quick change this back to none over here, just by selecting the target next to sprite and changing it to none. And then we'll change these back from single sprites to multiple sprites and hit apply. So now we've got these two sprite sheets, and each of them should be spliced up into a couple sprites. So we have this sprite editor button here per image. So we're just going to select which sprite we want and go to sprite editor. Make this a little bit bigger. And now we can use our mouse to split up the image however we want. We can make different sizes of frames. We can also edit the name of them. Typically, it'll append a little underscore, whatever the frame number is on the end. You can also change the position, border, pivot, all this cool stuff. But for most people, and especially for you guys, if you want a good workflow, you don't want to have to go into every single sprite sheet and manually pick out the frames for it. That is a total pain. It's a huge workflow problem. It's doing nothing but stopping you from getting stuff done. So luckily, Unity has a couple cool options to help you do this. You can grid by cell size. And what this lets you do is take the size of each frame of your sprite. So this is 307 by 343. Give it an offset, a padding. Your pivot is probably going to be center. That just means the center of your sprite is the center of your game object. And when you rotate it, it'll rotate around the center. Then just click slice. And now we've got one frame for every single one of these sprite sheet frames, which is awesome. So you just hit apply, and then you can close it. And now if you twirl open your sprite, you've got all the 8 frames of this animation all set to go and be used. So we've got a princess here. We'll just pop in one of the sprites as the default so we can see it in the editor. But now we're going to switch over and use the animation window and the animator. So we'll just pin this down here. The animation window is super helpful because it'll be handling most of the complexity of animating sprite sheets, which is most of the time just making sure that they play frame by frame at a regular pace. So the first thing that we're going to do is select our princess object, and I think that we have to put an animator on it first. So go to add component, and then I think it's miscellaneous animator. And then this animator controls the sprite. So let's go back up to our assets. We can make a new folder called animations. And we'll make a folder for our princess. And this is going to hold both our animator for our princess that makes sure that it knows which animations need to get played, and each of our animations, which are also going to be separate Unity objects. So we're going to right-click inside of our princess folder and go to create, and we want an animator controller. Let's call it princess again. Then we can fill out our animator by dragging this up to controller. We can leave avatar empty, Don't need to mess with apply root motion or update mode or culling mode. These are all things that are more applicable to 3D than 2D. So now that we've got an animator on it, when we go to our animation window, we've got some more buttons that we can play with, hopefully. Texture being dragged has no sprites. Leave me alone. All right. So it should be giving me a few more options than it is right now, but I mean, this is part of the process. Let's grab the animator window too, just to make sure. We've got stuff in there. Maybe it's just a incompatibility thing. So normally what this would let you do is just drag down and make a new animation, but I guess it's just not having any of that today. So we'll go through and we'll make it ourselves. Oh, never mind, they moved it into here for Unity. So just go into your main area for animation and click create. It's a bit of a UI change. And we'll make a new animation. I think that we have an idle animation right now. So we'll just name this animation idle. And now we've got our basic animation screen. All of our animations will appear here in the side, but until you have at least one, you won't get this little option down here for create new clip. It'll be over here in the center. So now we've got an idle animation, and we can check and we can say this one needs to run at 8 FPS. So the first thing you're going to do is go over to samples, and you want to change this to however many frames per second it's going to run at. This will just break it down so that you have 8 samples per second, and it'll label the frames for you at the top. The left of the colon being the second number, and the right of the colon being the frame number. So we have a record button here. We can click record to start changing the properties of our game object, and the animator will queue up these single changes on the timeline where they're supposed to be. So to get, I guess, the idea for this, right now our recorder is at the first frame and our animator is running. So let's change our sprite that we're rendering to our idle sprite by adding a property of our sprite renderer sprite. And now we've got these 2 points on here. If you're familiar with Flash, this will probably be pretty familiar. We've got these 2 points here which represent when we set this property of our sprite. So this last one here we're going to delete because we don't need our idle sprite to be set at the first frame and the very last frame. So we'll move the recorder here and we'll change our sprite to our second one. And so now if we switch between these 2 frames, you can see it changes between these 2 sprites. And then you just do this for the rest of them. It's kind of a boring process, and if you're interested, you can definitely write some cool editor scripts that will do all this for you. But this is basically what you gotta do. All right. Once you've got all of these queued up, you can hit play, and it'll play the animation for you by just running the bar over your animator timeline, and at each frame, it'll just change the sprite according to what it says it should be at that frame. So this is how you get your basic sprites animating, which is super awesome. So let's go put in our second animation. First, we want to hit the record button to stop recording. We don't want to accidentally record any other changes we make to our game object, because then they won't really persist outside and they'll just get tacked on to whatever frame we're editing in our animation. So we'll go create new clip, and we have a run animation. So just make one called run. We'll go check out how many frames per second this is. This is 18 frames per second. So we'll go back into our sprite editor and do our slice again. It keeps our pixels size from the last one, and it sliced it up for us automatically. Super cool. So we just hit apply, and now we've got this sliced up into a bunch of frames like we do the last one. So for our run animation, we want it to run at 18 frames per second, so we just change our sample size to 18. And then add a property, sprite renderer sprite. That'll add it at the beginning and end for us. Get rid of this last one because we don't need it. And now our first sprite is going to be princess run 1 underscore 0 at the end. And then for each subsequent frame, it's just going to be the next one for 12 frames. Super boring. If you're like me, you probably want to automate this, and you can. But from okay. So now we've got a run animation, and it'll play for us pretty smooth, just like our other animation. So now we've got these two awesome animations. So let's play our game and let's see what happens. So you can see we sort of just start at this idle animation and nothing really happens. That's super interesting. So let's check out our Animator here, which is our second tab that we open. You can open this by going to Window and then Animator. So to contrast the two, our animation window edits the separate frames and properties of our animation. It's sort of like a timeline for an animation. And our Animator is our state machine for our animation, for basically our whole object. And it controls switching between all of our different animations and what conditions they should switch under. So let's play around with this a little bit. You can see that we've got this entry here, and we've got any state, and I think that we have like an exit around here. Yeah. So we've got entry, exit, and any state. And we've got our two animations called run and idle, which is cool. So we made these two, and then Unity gives us these three by default. So right now we're in the idle animation, and you can see it's just looping over the idle animation over and over again. And that's pretty easy to see. So let's play with our Animator a little bit. Here we've got our entry, and we've got this edge right here, which is orange. And this basically says that when we enter the game and our Animator starts playing, that it should transition to the idle animation. And this will just keep looping as long as it has nowhere to go. So to make this idle animation transition into our run animation, we just right click on it and go make transition. Now we get this little arrow that follows us around. If we click on run, it'll attach it to it. So now we've got this idle animation going to our run. And if we click on our edge, it'll give us this view of what our animation actually does. So this is the preview for it. You can see that when the timeline passes over, that it switches from the idle to the run animation pretty nicely. But if you're doing sprite sheets, another thing that you'll want to do is to take this time that the animation takes to occur and reduce it a lot. This is so that it goes from one frame, from the very last frame of your idle animation into the very first frame of your running animation. This is good pretty much only for sprite sheets because that little period of time between them is the blending period. This is better for 3D when in between a character walking and running, they need to blend the positions of the arms and legs from this run state to standing on the ground. And if they just snap there instantly, it would look really bad. But the opposite is true for our sprite sheets. We want it to instantly snap there. We don't want it to like try to blend two frames together because that would look pretty weird. So we're going to reduce this time between them to 0, and we're going to put them right at each other's ends. And we can twirl open settings and check our exit time. This should be 1. And then our transition offset should be 0. Fixed duration, those are basically the only ones that you need to worry about. So what this means is when we get to the end of our idle animation, we'll take 0 seconds to transition into our run animation.
Is it possible to blend, because you said it's able to blend sprites?
Good question. So Unity cannot blend sprites. It can blend some things, not sprites. So I guess to illuminate this a little bit, let's go back and look at our princess animations. So these properties that we have set on here are all this sprite property. And this sprite property is a sprite object in C#. And Unity sort of doesn't care what type of property that it's animating is, as long as it's not a vector or some kind of number, or I think colors will also blend correctly. So I think we can check out curves from here. So let's check out our curves. So another thing that we'll see if you're more familiar with Flash or another animation system, you can see there are like no curves here for our sprite, even if we twirl it open. So let's try adding a new property on our dope sheet. Let's just animate our rotation for her. So our rotation is going to start off normal for our princess sprite. And then let's say by the end of this animation that we want our rotation to be, it's not going to rotate around the Y. Let's rotate around Z. And so we want her to be like that. So now Unity will animate correctly this interpolation between our two frames of our rotation. And if we check out our curves, we can see that our rotation has this nice line that goes smoothly up from our original rotation to our end rotation. The sprite does not animate the same way because we can't really like play with, yeah, this is changing other rotation properties. But our sprite can't animate the same way because you can't interpolate two sprites the way you can interpolate two rotations. But we can play with this curve more too if you're interested in this sort of thing. It's pretty cool. But we have these two keys here. These keys will start off as auto, but you can change them to something like smooth, in which case you get this cool handle where you can change how it animates over time. So you can see we get a little bounce at the end there.
Follow.
So if we change both of these to free smooth, we can make this more of an S-curve.
And make some easing to
Yeah.
make that animation look better.
So there. So we can ease this automatically interpolated property like a rotation. We can't do any sort of easing or interpolation on things like sprites. So I hope that answers your question. What's up, Spencer?
Tag me in, coach.
Sure.
So when David was showing you guys earlier how to create an animation frame by frame, like let's say we did like the idle, how do you go away from curves? Oh, dope sheet, that's where it is. And he showed you the tedious process of frame by frame, changing the frames. Oh, you're still recording, I'm gonna unrecord. A little cheat you could do. So we've got our idle here. What you can do is select every frame of an animation you have and drag and drop it in, and it'll do that for you. Let's see, where did I put that? No.
Hide the original one.
Yeah, so is it this one?
That's the original one.
That's the original. So ignore the original. This is the thing I just dropped in, and it's just an aggregation of a bunch of sprites, but it'll still work. So that stops you from having to do the frame by frame thing David is showing you. If you just select them all in your project folder and drag and drop them into the hierarchy, it just does it for you.
However, if we check out our animation tab, we will notice, oh no, did it pick out samples too? Oh no, this samples is 12.
Yeah, it didn't, you'll have to make some finer adjustments.
Yeah,
It's not going to be
faster.
Yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but it's, yeah.
Let's turn this one back on and we can compare their idle animations.
Yeah, so it defaulted or maybe guessed at doing it at a sample of 12. I'm not sure if it's default or guess. So you can tell it on the same speed. So if you do that, it's going to be faster if it's a long sprite sheet, but you still have to check and make sure it did everything you wanted. So in this case, the samples just need to be changed to 8.
Yeah.
But
so,
other than that, it'll stop you from doing, the tedious frame by frame.
but not if you want multiple animations on the same one.
No. It's just like, it's really good for if you have a quick thing, like if you have an effect of like you punch someone, there's like a mini pop.
Yeah.
I do that all the time for those sort of things because I don't
Yeah.
need to do anything else with it, but just a quick little trick.
Yeah. So this is good for if you just have one sprite sheet that you need to animate. You can just quick drag it in there. It's a cool tip.
Yeah, and also it makes the controller for you, the animator controller, it makes that, and it makes the animation like the .anim file. So it does all that behind the scenes, but then you just need to check your project folder.
Yeah.
It'll create that for you, see?
So you see it gave us this animator and this animation by default. So we'll get rid of this one just because we don't need it right now. Get rid of those. All right, so on our princess, we've still got our idle and run animation. Our run animation now makes it sort of like twirl around. We've got this nice curve for our rotation. We picked the starting and ending points, and we told Unity, hey, I want you to interpolate between them this way. So let's go check out our animator again. So let's make a transition from idle to run, and then one back. And then we'll select these and change it so our exit time is 1, and our transition duration is 0 for both of them. That'll make them do that nice hard snap between our sprite sheets. So now if we play our game, we get our two animations that just toggle between each other. And you can see what's happening in our animator tab pretty nicely. This is great for debugging. If you're like, why am I stuck in this animation? I shouldn't be stuck here. You can just check out your animation tab, your animator tab, and it'll show you which state you're in and which edges you have coming out of it. So there you go. That's most of the basics of using the animator class. You can control it completely by code. It's pretty easy. You just tell it which state to transition to or set certain conditions on it, and it'll let you control it pretty easily that way. So any questions about anything related to animating in Unity? Cool. So that's all you got to do.